Hello, and welcome to another wonderful Wednesday webinar. And we are live and direct from a field in Somerset for Shindig Festival at the moment, I think. But we have the great honour to link up Jojo from Stop Ecocide International. Jojo Mehta is a bit of a legend, and with the late Polly Higgins that we've known about and supported for many years, has been pushing the ecocide law for many years, and there's been some successes recently that we're going to hear a bit more about. But we all need to get behind the campaign to, change the law. What does system change actually look like? And ecocide law to me is actual real system change. So how can we get behind Jojo and the work of Stop Ecocide International, and any way our network can help each other? So over to you, Jojo. Thank you very much for coming, and yeah, tell us about the
Thank
great
you
work you're
very
doing.
much. And I
Yeah.
realised I'm going to rename myself so that I'm not just a faceless organisation. There we go. Jojo Mehta, Stop Ecocide International. So that's me. Yeah, I mean it's great to be with you tonight. And Helen was just sort of reminding me of the origins of how I kind of got into all of this. I think anyone who's in the activist space has had a moment of kind of wake up and outrage that has kind of got them out of their armchairs, and in my case in terms of the armchair activism and onto the street. And for me that was fracking. As some of you know, I was involved strongly with the anti-fracking movement in the UK, and it was through that I met Polly Higgins. It was one of those moments where, I mean, I remember when I first read about fracking, it was about 2012, 2013, and it was potentially coming to the UK. And I hadn't really heard about it before. I started reading about it and thinking, this is insane. Couldn't see any angle from which it was a good idea, whether anything from environmental to economic, it just seemed like a disaster. And I remember talking about it with my family and friends, and my little daughter was 5 at the time. She's 16 now. And she burst into tears. And she's like, Mummy, I don't understand. If they're poisoning the ground, they must know they're poisoning themselves. You've got to call them and tell them to stop because they're going to die. And it was such a moment where I was just like, my 5-year-old understands this. How can it be so problematic, to have this understood in a general sense? So, that was, and she literally kind of prodded me to basically go and talk to my local MP. I mean, she didn't call him an MP, she didn't know that at the time, but she'd been to the local ballot box with me, kind of turning cartwheels around the hall while I was putting my crosses in the box for local elections. And she said, can't you talk to the voting man? And so I ended up having this conversation with our local, at the time, Tory MP, and having all my questions dodged and sort of moved around, and thinking, well, that's never happening again, and properly informing myself and starting to give talks, write leaflets, as and organize demonstrations, that kind of thing. And that's how I came into the sort of orbit of Polly Higgins, because she actually moved to our area, which is in Stroud in Gloucestershire, which, as you know, now has a little bit of a reputation. I mean, Stop Ecocide International started here, but so did Extinction Rebellion, so did Ecotricity. There's clearly something in the water. But yeah, so Polly moved here, and it was one of those kindred spirit moments. I mean, within half an hour, we just knew we were going to be working together. And she just had this really straightforward way of approaching mass damage and destruction to nature. It's like, let's call it ecocide and make it a crime. And that just felt like such an intuitive, obvious approach, that it felt like a bit of a no-brainer to kind of put some energy behind it. Of course, at that time, neither of us were paid. We both worked for nothing for many years. But that the movement since then has just ballooned into something enormous, and I think that's there's lots of reasons for that. But one of the, perhaps key milestones, tragically, but in perhaps a rather human way, was actually Polly passing away in 2019 from a very rapid cancer. By the time they even realised she had it, it was too late to do anything about it. But I think sometimes you have this phenomenon with people who are kind of strong figureheads for something. It kind of has others sit back a bit and say, well, she's doing that, so I don't need to. And of course, when she was no longer there anymore, people started to approach me, obviously as a co-founder of this, what was now this public campaign, and say, what can we do to help? This can't die with her. And that was the beginning of what became, if you like, a kind of gigantic dot joining exercise that's still going on today. And what I realized was that there were campaigners, there were politicians, there were academics, there were, lawyers from all different parts of the world that had, a lot of them, been directly inspired by her, but who really wanted to help to move this forward. And I think at the time, we really, there were just a few of us basically volunteers at the time. It was a situation of, well, we'll talk to anyone who will listen, because that's actually all we can do. Now, what that actually became over time was a kind of concrete approach to something, i.e. to keep cross-feeding that conversation in as broad a way as possible. Because and I'm sure, many of this audience will be aware of, is that, politicians don't like to be the first to a party. They want to know that it's safe to talk about something. They don't want to be putting themselves out on a limb. And so the more, the bigger a conversation there is about something, the more likely it is that the political players will join that conversation. And of course, with the criminalization of ecocide, in other words, making it a crime to severely or to create severe and either widespread or long-term harm to the environment, is essentially, it's something that was previously thought of as quite sort of left field, but actually in the wake of mobilizations like Extinction Rebellion, like Fridays for Future and so on, it actually became much more of a kind of a common sense, obvious solution, I suppose. And of course, what it ultimately involves is persuading governments. So in a sense, over the time since that time, our goal is always what it had, what it always was, which is to effectively place ecocide alongside genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity at the International Criminal Court, has become a conversation that is now spanning many governments, many countries. Just in the last year, there've been half a dozen, actually, I think it's 8 or 9 now, proposals of ecocide law into different parliaments. Even in the UK, the House of Lords, there's been a private member's bill. Of course, that will now fall, as you probably have all heard. We've got an election coming up early July. That's literally just been announced today. And much of the world is going to the polls this year. Got European elections coming up as well, and many, many other countries. Now, what's interesting about that is that what we are actually interestingly avoiding, or trying to avoid, is making ecocide law an election issue. Because we're talking, with ecocide law, we're talking about creating a sort of external parameter, a criminal law parameter, that is absolutely fundamental, kind of common sense, but it's fundamental and foundational and needs to be ongoing into the future. What we don't want for it to be thought of as is some kind of, here's an environmental banner we're waving just because there's an election coming up, or here's something that we need to do urgent, quick now because we're in a climate emergency, which is not to say that we're not, but actually what we're looking at is a kind of really fundamental piece, a fundamental, effectively missing piece that in our current legal structure. And so we kind of aim to drive this conversation at the government level all around the world. But what we don't do on the whole is make it an election issue if we can avoid it. What we do is we point to people who are talking about it, which is really great. And in case you didn't know, the only party that I'm aware of in the UK that is actually publicly supporting it is the True and Fair Party, Gina Miller's party. But yeah, as a sort of fundamental approach, we have kind of, I suppose we operate on 2 levels now. So we now have, just to give you an idea, we now have a paid team of around 25. That's probably about a dozen full-time equivalent, mostly the international team. We also have regional coordinators in Africa, in Latin America, but we also have national campaigns in around 50 countries now. And that's extraordinary. And a lot of that, the beginnings of that growth happened during lockdown, which was kind of remarkable. And actually for us, it was kind of a silver lining in a way, because at that time, there's no way we could have afforded to get anybody to the kinds of UN conferences or, high-level gatherings that we needed to bring this conversation into. But of course, during lockdown, all of that went online, which meant that suddenly we actually did have access to those things. And, a lot of the conversation grew quite fast during that time. And by the time everything kind of, I guess, started up again, you could say, we had a much bigger team, we had more funds, we had the ability to actually potentially access those events. So that's been a really interesting kind of path to be on, I suppose, and it's been virtually non-stop. And I think I'd like to sort of highlight a couple of other milestones, and then I don't want to be too long in the introduction, because I think this will get more interesting when we start getting questions and answers and so on, because I could just talk, all evening, because this is what I do day in, day out. But some other key milestones on the diplomatic level. It's actually, I mean, I think this is interesting. It's the victim states that have been the most forthcoming. So in the climate space, it's been Vanuatu, which is one of the most climate vulnerable countries on the planet. It's a Pacific island state. And they actually brought the conversation about ecocide law back onto the diplomatic table, where it hadn't been for nearly 50 years. I mean, it was first mentioned in 1972, I think, by the Swedish Prime Minister Olof Palme, but it had been, you could say, in a bit of a political and legal backwater in the intervening time. The concept, of course, was resurrected by Polly Higgins. And the conversation around it started to grow, but it was Vanuatu, which was the first country, the first state level intervention, and that was at the International Criminal Court's annual assembly in 2019, where they, in their official government statement, they urged all members of the International Criminal Court, all member states, to seriously consider the addition of ecocide as an international crime, as a fifth international crime. So that was a really major moment. And the conversation then started to evolve at a state level for the first time in a long time. But possibly the biggest milestone has been the emergence of an actual international definition of ecocide. Because, I mean, there had been definitions in the past. Polly Higgins had her own definition. We used that as a campaign definition for many years. But of course, if you want a government to take something like this seriously, it needs to have a level of kind of gravitas and credibility that any one lawyer would not be able to provide. And so in 2020, we had the good fortune that, and by that point, we had a charitable foundation as well. And our foundation was approached by Swedish parliamentarians who were interested in us convening a panel to define ecocide, but an international panel, so that it would have proper, weight, global weight, and to draft a definition that was credible and serious, and that they could then propose to their government and say, could you put this forward at the International Criminal Court? And so, I mean, on the basis of that, we were able to convene a remarkable panel of 12 international lawyers to spend 6 months, which they did in the early part of 2021, 6 months drafting ecocide as a definition of ecocide as an international crime. And that was preceded by quite a big public consultation, which had hundreds of responses from, individuals, but also from organizations, from universities, from think tanks, all sorts of responses, as well as a particular group that was convened as well from Indigenous spokespeople as well. So all of that sort of came into the mix in terms of that drafting process. And the result of it, I think it's worth showing you. I don't normally do slides, but what I will do is if I turn off my camera, what you should see is the core of the definition. Can you see that? If you make that big, so if you do like speaker focus on your screen.
Yep, we can see that.
Yeah, you should be able to see that. So it's so effectively, it's ecocide means unlawful or wanton acts committed with knowledge that there's a substantial likelihood of severe and either widespread or long-term damage to the environment being caused by those acts. Now, there is oh, it says I can't stop my video. You might have to let me start it again now. And let's see. Okay, do I have permission to open it again? Yeah, there I am.
Yeah,
there I am. So I had a little thing saying you can't start your video. Yeah, I mean, there is another paragraph that defines those terms in more detail. But that core definition is rather it's actually brilliant, and it's brilliant for a number of reasons. Firstly, it's quite intuitively understandable. I mean, you or I can understand it. We don't have to be legal experts to understand it, but those who are legal experts in that area of international criminal law, and will recognize those terms, because it's actually drawing on strong precedents from the Geneva Protocols, from the Environmental Modification Convention in the 70s, but also from other parts of the Rome Statute. So the language is familiar. That's important, of course, when you're dealing at the diplomatic level. People do not want to be looking at something they've never seen before or never seen anything like it. So it's good to have something that relates. Secondly, it has these two thresholds. So for ecocide to be, for an international crime to be committed, it must be either causing or threatening severe and either widespread or long-term harm. So we're not talking about chopping down the trees on the village green. It has to be something really quite major, because it's got to be something that's either cross-boundary, that involves a whole ecosystem, that damages a large number of people, or indeed a whole species, that kind of thing. But then it also has to be unlawful or wanton. So it has to be in breach of something that already exists, whether that's some kind of rights framework or international environmental agreement or environmental regulation. So it has to be unlawful in some way, and either that or it has to be wanton. So it either has to be breaking some kind of rule already, or it has to be disproportionate to the benefit that it's actually aiming to provide. So in terms of how bad the damage is, which means that even if something potentially has a permit, if it's really severely destructive, it could also fall under this definition. Now, from a very personal perspective, that was an extraordinary moment when that was launched. It was actually launched on the 22nd of June in 2021. And the reason that, just from a personal perspective, let's say before that date, I was able to read all the emails in my inbox. After that, I've never been able to since, just because it was just sort of ramped up and up and up the attention that was getting the initiative was getting. So this definition landed very well. It landed well in the media world. It's landed well in the political world. All the proposals that have been put into jurisdictions around the world have been based in, to a greater or lesser degree, around this definition. So it's obviously it obviously struck a chord. It's probably worth mentioning one particular thing that sometimes pulls people up short about it is that, surely anything that causes that, that severe and widespread level of harm should be considered ecocide, whether or not it's already illegal. And of course, one of the things around that is when the lawyers were discussing that, I remember thinking this and thinking, well, surely it should just cover anything that creates that damage. But what I realized is that when and this has become clearer and clearer as we do more of the sort of high level discussions with ambassadors and ministers and so on, it matters that the law will sort of mesh in with existing law. It's not going to kind of tread across or sort of step on the toes of existing law. So it's not like by putting that proposed definition forward, we're saying, well, whatever you had in your penal code up till now is not valid because this is going to be there instead. Instead, what it's saying is that, it's actually expressing something which is a serious concern with environmental law. And one of the main reasons we need a law of ecocide is that existing environmental laws and regulations are not well followed. They're not well enforced either. They're often not well monitored. And so when you put in place a kind of criminal law that acts almost as a sort of a container or a backstop for those laws, what you're also doing is creating a completely different consciousness around them. And this is where the whole aspect of criminal law is so important, because criminal law it focuses on the moral aspects of what we feel is okay or not okay to do. Effectively, it defines what we consider to be unacceptable, what we consider to be dangerous. And of course, the way that our economic activity and, in various industrial practices has been treating the natural world and indeed people over recent decades is without doubt dangerous. It's dangerous to people, it's dangerous to climate, it's dangerous to biodiversity, it's dangerous to the living world. And so to define that with criminal law is actually sort of deeply appropriate, if you like. And to have it, you know, as it is defined there, to have it effectively be a backstop. In other words, if you're not meeting your environmental obligations and you're causing this level of harm, then you're potentially in serious crime territory, is actually a really powerful thing to do. And it's also the other thing that was a little bit of a eureka moment for me, particularly having come from an activist background in all of this, was that, of course, there are activists, there are experts, there are NGOs, there are academics working on improving different particular areas of environmental regulation all the time. And that's really, really important work. And it's really important that that work is supported and encouraged and drawn forward. And this definition, it actually does that because, of course, as you improve regulation in other areas, you're also improving this definition. Because of course then that then adds to the number of things that potentially in breach of which you would be potentially committing ecocide. So it gives the definition a kind of dynamism and a sort of sense of actually drawing the whole body of environmental law forward, encouraging it to improve in as many areas as possible. The other thing that I think is really important about this definition, and I'll come back to the sort of progress around Europe in a minute in regard to this, is that there is something very simple and intuitive about phrasing a crime in this way. It's actually not it's fairly close to the principle of how the law, how murder works. Effectively, it's not how you kill somebody that defines murder as murder. It's the fact that the person ends up dead. And this is the same kind of principle. It's not the activity per se that is the crime. It is the threat of, or the actual causing of, severe and either widespread and long-term harm. And the reason that I emphasize that is it's really very important in comparison to how environmental law works at the moment in most instances, because most, not all, but most environmental law is in the regulatory sphere. Most of it is very prescriptive and detailed, and a lot of it is lists of particular activities that are prohibited or can only be done to a certain degree or things like that. Now, the problem with all of that is that there is a tendency to sort of game that system. So, big polluters, for example, will have a tendency to either constantly go right up to the dangerous edge of what's permitted, or, and this also happens, as I'm sure you're all aware, then what you might end up with is a kind of cost benefit analysis in the sense that okay, yes, we're in breach of these regulations, but we're going to make X amount of profit, and that's going to be way more important than any court case or compensation we might have to pay. And of course, we can probably afford better lawyers. I mean, viz cases like the Texaco Chevron case in Ecuador, for example. But also what you're going to see is you're going to see people kind of recategorizing things so that they don't fall into the section that is prohibited or controversial. And I'm well aware of this from 2015 with the infrastructure bill in the UK, where there was a kind of redefining of what fracking actually meant, so that effectively people could say, oh, well, we're not actually fracking, we're doing something else. Whereas with this definition of ecocide, you can't do that. There's a kind of a reality check around it. It actually forces the kind of, your risk managers, your legal counsels, to consult with your operational people who actually are expert potentially in what they're doing in their particular practice, and actually say, well, what level of harm is being created by this? And let's actually look at, we actually have to have a different approach to due diligence. We have to actually look at what is the scientific information, what is the research information in the public domain, of which there is myriad now, about what kinds of activities create what kinds of harms, so that we're actually having to link what's actually happening on the ground, what we're doing, and the possibility of our boss going to jail, for example. So so sometimes we almost think of it as kind of a reality check law, if you like, and that's a really important aspect of that international definition, and that approach of effectively saying severe, widespread or long-term harm is the problem. And the other thing with that, of course, is that definition also remains future-proof in terms of potential destructive activities that could be dreamed up between now and, who knows, 2030, 2040. technology is advancing all the time. You know, we don't know what destructive practices might be dreamed up, and so having something that relates to the potential consequences is actually really quite important, and it future-proofs that definition. So any list of acts is going to potentially go out of date before too long because of just how fast things progress. So I hope that sort of gives a kind of broad picture of why that definition is so important and so impactful, and it's, you know, and how it's really sort of driven the conversation since then. And to see where we've actually kind of got to with this is that it is probably the best way to say it is that, you know, 5 years ago, no governments were publicly talking about criminalizing ecocide. Now it's pretty much the hot topic in, you know, environmental law, and it's being proposed in numerous different parliaments. And you know, most sort of powerfully, the EU has just adopted a new directive, an environmental crimes directive, which includes an offence. They're calling it a qualified offence, sort of acts as an aggravating factor, if you like, to address conduct that is, and they state conduct that's comparable to ecocide. They state that in the preamble to the law, and that's the first time the word ecocide has come into EU law. It's not in the operative text, but the operative text is very good. It's not quite as general an offence as what I just described as being so powerful about the international one. It applies to a range of, I think it's 18 crimes. But some of those crimes that have been newly introduced, I mean, some are from previous EU law. Sorry, I think there's an echo. I think somebody might need to mute. Not sure. Okay.
Okay.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, so what it does is it basically says if you commit any of these crimes and you threaten or you create this kind of severity, this severe level of harm, again, it's that severe and irreversible kind of phraseology, then you're in a sort of new territory. It's more serious, it's comparable to ecocide, it invokes heavier sentencing, bigger fines if you're a corporation, for example. And it also goes a little bit further in some areas, which is very useful. For example, it looks at permits and how permits are issued. So if the activity that you're engaged in is being carried out under a legitimate permit, it's only a legitimate permit if it has not had any kind of coercion, fraud, corruption, or these other aspects that, you know, sadly quite often do go with the acquiring of permits. So it actually is quite a powerful text, in fact. And it's very, very encouraging. And what that means for the, you know, the sort of moving forward at the international level is that has, of course, then pushed that conversation as well. So the conversations that we're now having with states and state representatives at the level of the International Criminal Court has now moved onto another footing. So you could say it's shifted up a gear. So we've been nurturing the conversation at the ICC's annual assemblies, the International Criminal Court's Assembly of States Parties, every year for the last 7 years. And that conversation has been quite live, and we've been holding official side events alongside states that are sort of open to this discussion. And so it's a very live conversation there. But now it's kind of moved more from a kind of, you know, this might happen, is it going to happen, to, okay, we can see this is now an established legal direction of travel. So it's more of a question of, you know, when and how might it happen rather than if. So, you know, this is a really, really exciting moment for this whole initiative. It's really kind of, it's now on a kind of solid legal sort of advancing footing, and it's being taken very seriously all around the world. And actually, I mean, it's almost, I think in a geopolitical situation like the one we have right now on the planet, it's one of the few real bright points of, you know, hope and light in terms of putting something in place that can actually be used and enforced ongoingly, but that can actually genuinely support all of those areas of environmental law that if they were all followed would be great, but mostly they're not. So there's a real kind of there's a very sort of tangible now sense of, you know, things moving in the right direction, at least in this area. One last thing I'll say before we sort of perhaps open to more sort of questions and conversation is that as a standalone crime, ecocide would be addressing massive environmental damage both in peacetime and in times of conflict. And of course, at the moment, that's a very live conversation due to the situation in Ukraine, due to the situation in Gaza. I mean, we as an organization, we don't take political sides in any situation if we can possibly avoid it. But we do enter the conversation when a state themselves starts talking about ecocide, which of course Ukraine did very strongly about a year and a half ago. And so that, you know, that became quite a live conversation. And also what's quite interesting is that, again, coming back to that theme I was mentioning earlier about victim states, you know, Ukraine as a victim state in terms of conflict has been very, very vocal about supporting ecocide law. They've supported very strongly at the European level. They supported at the Council of Europe level, rather. And they've also started to use their own domestic provision for ecocide, which had never been used. And they were one of the few countries that did have some kind of provision. And I think it's really interesting that both in the case of these two very vocal states about it, Vanuatu and Ukraine, you know, one is a victim in the context of climate, one is a victim in the context of conflict. There's this sense that there's actually a kind of almost a political generosity around this. You know, these kind of actors, the political actors, if you like, are not just sitting there saying, you know, woe is me, help us, which of course they are, you know, also, that also is happening, but they're actually saying, we don't want to see anybody suffer what we're suffering. And so there's a sense of almost a sense of responsibility for pushing the conversation on a wider global level. And that's been, I mean, that's been quite striking and actually quite moving at times to see that happen. So yeah, it's a very interesting moment. And I think one of the, I mean, I'd probably say one more thing about the criminal law aspect is that it's very understandable that people almost straight away think about who could be punished by a new law. And that's, yeah, I completely understand that. There's also, you know, especially within, you know, I mean, I imagine in an audience like this where there's a real sense of, you know, there's an injustice that needs to be rectified, and that's absolutely understandable. But of course, what criminal law is ultimately meant to do is change behavior. So what we're ultimately looking for by putting this law in place is shifting the cultural mentality so that, you know, effectively, so that they're, I suppose you could call it almost creating a taboo, a kind of a cultural taboo around mass destruction of nature, which has not been present and which it is now becoming ever more obvious should be at play in our general mindset. And of course, the further this conversation moves, the more that actually does become a cultural consideration. So I think I'll leave it there for now, and let's see what people would like to come back with and talk about.
That's absolutely fantastic. Thank you so much, Jojo. Really very comprehensive, and thank you for the, you know, the untold work that both you and like Polly Higgins have been doing to really move this forward. It's absolutely critical, the work you're doing for system change. So folks, yes, my love, folks, if you've got a question, you can use the reactions thing down the bottom and raise a hand like that. I'm currently trying to facilitate there on a phone, so it's definitely easier if you stick a hand up, or maybe Helen can help with there. But if you've got a question or a feedback or anything you want to ask or share with the group, then you can do that. And seeing it on a mobile phone is not as easy as on a... Okay, oh, I can see everyone now a bit better. Right, anyone else sticking their hand up, help me out here. So any questions? Helen, go for it.
Go on, I'll start the ball rolling. Is there anywhere you can think of that has really used this law to good effect?
So in most places, it's still not in place. So obviously it's difficult to use a law when it's not there. It's just beginning to be used in countries that have it. So Ukraine being an obvious example, where they've now got a dozen or so cases related to environmental damage during the conflict. We fully anticipate, I mean, this is an interesting one. We fully anticipate that most prosecutions will actually be taken in national jurisdictions, not at the International Criminal Court. The main reason being the International Criminal Court is supposed to work that way. It's supposed to be a court of last resort. So our original aim in kind of pushing for an international crime was partly to do with sort of speed and coherence, in the sense that we felt that if we went sort of country by country, we could be there forever, and there would obviously be potentially different definitions in different places, but the way that it's worked out is that the international proposed definition has actually provoked that coherence, in a sense, from national jurisdictions where people are putting bills in that are very closely related. So the whole original idea of creating something that is kind of universally similar in some way is actually materializing anyway, but not through, mainly through the emergence of the definition. But the thing is with international crimes is that, I mean, let's say you're a war criminal, the likelihood of your own country prosecuting you is minuscule, which means that you will end up at that court of last resort, if you like. Whereas with ecocide, it's not so much like that, because generally speaking, it's a corporate crime. I mean, one could conceive of instances where, a government minister or even perhaps a head of state could be accused of it. I mean, actually, there were a couple of filings against Jair Bolsonaro, for example, at the International Criminal Court, not for ecocide, because ecocide wasn't in place, but they would have been for ecocide had ecocide been in place. But the majority of cases are likely to involve corporate actors. And that will mean individuals, because criminal law mostly focuses on the individual, who are in positions of superior responsibility or decision-making power. And those cases could then be taken in any ratifying state. So, for example, Belgium, which has just adopted ecocide law, could prosecute ecocide in its own jurisdiction. And when it comes to an international law, any ratifying state, any state that ratifies it as an international crime, will be able to take prosecutions in its own country. And that we imagine that this will both restore the ICC to its complementary role, but it will also effectively sort of respect the sovereignty of individual states that will have then integrated that law into their own penal codes. What we imagine also is that any initial cases are likely to be quite straightforward pollution cases or direct harm cases, rather than, for example, climate emissions cases, just because there are lots of lawyers who'll be wanting to get their teeth into this material and into this, creating jurisprudence and building up case law and all of that. And they're going to want it to work, and they're going to want it to be clear and understandable. So initial cases are likely to be quite direct pollution cases. Now, in reality, that often comes down to some of the similar perpetrators as the climate stuff. So, I mean, if you think about, I mean, to give an example, that the horrific pollution in the Niger Delta, which is water pollution, air pollution, and so on, is effectively at the hands of big oil, in the same way that the emissions, or that, for example, we think about the way information was hidden by big oil years ago, that could actually be that kind of action, if it was taking place after the adoption of ecocide law, could potentially fall under that kind of provision as well. But yeah, that sort of gives you a little bit of a sense of what kinds of things might be the case.
I'm sort of wondering if it can be used. I'm very much against Drax with their cutting down all the virgin forests, etc. And I saw a thing about, it was the head of forestry in Canada who was, if you like, tasked with allowing them to cut down half of these trees, has now left the forestry department and works for Drax.
Yes, I mean, we see this kind of revolving situation.
And you sort of think, is something, can it be used on someone like that?
Well, put it this way, I think one of the most useful ways to think about this law is to think about what kinds of conversations might be happening differently if it were in place. So, I mean, and a good example from the UK for me is something like HS2. I mean, I imagine had Ecocide law been in place when HS2 was first being discussed, I don't doubt for a second that the project would still have probably moved ahead. But I also think that it would be extremely unlikely that they would have run the route through 108 ancient woodlands, because that would have been ecocidal, you know, or it would have at least been in the running for consideration of ecocide. And so even though we don't have a specific definition in place, we can say that if that, you know, if one can imagine people at the drawing board stage of that project actually actively looking for ways to avoid doing that, because they wouldn't want to get close to that particular boundary. And I actually even read a report at one point from a guy who had worked out a route it could have taken without cutting down all of those woodlands.
Wow.
Clearly it was possible, which means that, you know, effectively those kind of considerations were not happening, and all, you know, I would say certainly would have been happening had ecocide law been in place. So it's good to sort of think of those kinds of examples of what could have been averted. And the same with the you know, I mean, again, I mean, I think of the Chevron case in Ecuador, you know, where the indigenous and local communities had to somehow club together to be able to take Chevron to court. Now, obviously, if you've got a criminal law, it isn't like that. It's not, you know, a community against a company. It's actually a reporting to the state and a prosecution by the state. So yeah, a very different kind of situation.
Jojo, there's a couple of points I want to just come back on there. That's, you know, it's absolutely brilliant. I mean, what you are talking about here is system change and changing the whole paradigm. As activists, you know, we're very involved with many movements since the early 90s, and the tree protest, the road protest, right up to anti-HS2, and you know, so many of these campaigns, if there was an ecocide law in, would have been stopped earlier, because the things we've stood up against and climbed up in trees and tunnels and rooftops are ecocidal, and we would have had the tools to actually stop some of this before, you know, and it really is incredible work, and it's what we really need to a lot of our activist movements for years have been painting banners and talking about system change, but I've been asking our movement back, what does system change actually look like? What is it? We use those two words, but to me, ecocide law is system change. I just wondered if you could say a little bit more. There was some good news recently, the newspaper thing about the EU bringing this in, and I know we've been giving out leaflets for ecocide law for many years, many different centres, so it's really good to hear some news that there's some shifts there from the, you know, European Union, that this could be actually brought in. Is there a bit more updates on that you could say something about?
Well, that's I mean, I brought that into a little bit into what I was talking about, in the sense that this new directive, which is the Environmental Crimes Directive that's been brought in the EU, it effectively addresses conduct that's comparable to ecocide. That's the way that they phrase it. So what we can say with you know, with clarity, is that there is a clear legal direction of travel happening within the next 2 years. The EU member states will need to transpose that directive into their own penal codes. So effectively what that means is that there'll be 25 countries that will have to incorporate this law within their own criminal codes. So, you know, that is quite a powerful step in the right direction. You know, looking at previous record, if you like, it may, you know, different countries are faster or slower at adopting things, and there are slightly different approaches to environmental criminalization in different countries. And I'm not an expert on every single one of those, but what we're seeing is effectively something that is showing that this way of using legal tools to approach systemic problems is something that is now starting to embed, I suppose. And actually what we're seeing also is a kind of convergence of these legal tools around environmental protection and a response to climate and environment. So, for example, you probably have seen that the European Court of Human Rights recently brought a judgment in favour of some women from Switzerland who were accusing their government of not having taken enough action around climate, and that was actually upheld by the European Court of Human Rights. We've also seen just this week, we've seen the International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea, which is based in Hamburg, I believe, has just come out with a climate climate change advisory opinion, saying that all states have a responsibility to limit their emissions, and that actually the more developed states have even more of a responsibility to do so, because the burden of the effects of climate change is affecting states that have had very, very little to do with putting us in the position that we're in terms of exacerbating climate change. So we're seeing that these and of course the International Court of Justice as well is working on an advisory opinion also on climate change, as is the Inter-American Court. So all of these kind of international courts and tribunals are now starting to kind of weigh in on the climate and environment situation in a really quite a positive way. And this is really important because it's very clear that the climate COP talks are, have not moved fast enough. And actually, there's this kind of frustration, and you can feel it obviously in an audience like this is very clear, but it's actually also happening, in the corridors of the UN. States are frustrated with how slow, the pace is of actually addressing what's happening. And so and actually the same is true even in the business world. There are, particularly the sustainability leaders, of course, are calling for stronger regulations and legal moves, because that actually then starts to level the playing field, so that doing the right thing becomes something that they can do that makes sense business wise as well, so that it's not just, effectively they're not constantly being undercut by people with fewer scruples who just externalize the costs of the damage that they're doing. So I think what we're seeing here is really quite a broad level of convergence that's beginning to emerge in all of these different kind of legal areas, and ecocide law is like a key piece in that puzzle. I mean, in the sense that, I don't doubt that we're sort of heading for a fairly tough couple of decades with what's happening climate-wise and environmentally. And if something like this that creates an outer parameter is, if something like that isn't put in place, everything else continues to be an uphill struggle. Whereas once you put this in place, everything else gets easier, because there's a framework that is naturally going to start steering decision making in a better direction.
Okay, I think Sean's got a question there, and then Elena's put a couple in the chat that she wants read out. But Sean, do you want to go for your question, and then I'll just clarify one question with Elena?
Yeah, thanks, Jojo.
Sure.
Fascinating talk so far. Just following on that theme, and you're saying about the EU law, it was just a question, really. There's been a recent case in France brought against Total Energies, and I understand that was made by 5 or 6 individuals. So they're now, their equivalent to the Crown Prosecutor is now deciding whether they can take action against the CEO of Total Energies,
right,
for knowing about the damage they were doing, 30 years ago. Is there is that anything to do with the European law, or is that something quaint to France? And is there something that prevents us doing something similar in this country?
So the Total case won't be based on the recent directive, because it's too recent for that to be the case. And of course, with new laws generally are not retroactive. So if there's that's an action that's been taken some years ago, it would be necessary to legally unearth what it was in breach of at the time, that existed at the time, and under, and if there's a way of evidencing that it was in breach of laws in existence at that time, then it could potentially still be taken, unless there is some kind of there's a limitation. Some laws, there's a limitation period. It has to be done within a certain number of years. So it does depend on the law. Not all laws have limitation periods, but some do. So I suppose the very simple answer is I don't know. I can't give you an instant answer right now, but that sort of outlines the kind of principles of how that would work.
But I assume there's some existing law in France that they could bring that.
Yeah.
Against, which we don't have the equivalent
necessarily have here.
Yeah. Okay, thanks.
Okay, does that help, Sean? I think there's a question here in the chat, which is from Elena. Just asking to clarify one, but one of them was about recent client Earth and the rest. Sorry, let me just try and find that. I'm going to be back in the general. Running this on a phone isn't always as easy as it could be. So from Elena, what's she saying there?
Oh, is this best for corporations then rather than governments? Is it about ecocide law, you mean?
And there was one about how does this relate to Client Earth and recent ones where they're taking the government. How does this link to governments and cases like Client Earth versus UK government?
Yeah, no, that's it is a slightly different kind of situation than a criminal law. So with ecocide law, as it's transposed into national jurisdictions, it may also cover corporate and normally a government won't legislate against itself. So effectively, if you were looking at something at ministerial or head of state level, you'd probably be looking at the International Criminal Court. But in terms of corporations, yes, that often would be included at government level, although it's not at the ICC, because the ICC deals only with specific individuals, actual natural persons, not legal persons as corporations can be. But in relation to Client Earth is litigating in a or private or civil law sense, in the sense that it's taking is directly taking a case against either a government or a corporation or what have you. And that's not the same as a criminal prosecution. But Client Earth is doing the most incredible work. I mean, what we do is very much complementary. I mean, we're not a legal firm, we're an advocacy organization that, and in fact, come to think of it, they're a charity, but they have lots and lots of lawyers. And they effectively take actual direct cases, which is not something that we do. But they've been having some incredible wins around the world in terms of holding corporates and governments to account using existing law. So they're using laws that exist. So obviously, as soon as an ecocide law is in place, Client Earth would then have access to, being able to potentially, take file cases, file charges or what have you. Under that, but it is a slightly different situation, because it's, like I say, it's not one actor against another actor, it's a report to a state which then takes action.
Okay, that's good. Elena's in a place where she can't reply at the moment because it's noisy in the background, Sam, but if you do want to pop anything else in the chat, Elena. I've got one thing. I was chatting to a friend earlier. His son is studying to law, and we were talking about this could be a new growth area of law if these laws come in. Is something that more people could train up in. I mean, I found out something very shocking a little while ago. I'm not going to mention who it exactly was, but somebody told me that one of the biggest ways, there were a lot of lawyers suing the NHS for operations that had gone wrong and were making it out of it. But so I was a bit shocked about, actually, because big support of the NHS. My mum is a nurse, and I think we've got to be supporting the NHS, not suing it. But the situation there is, if these laws come in, then many more people could actually be challenging these corporations that are destroying the environment. So, it's a new area of law that could be explored more. Plus, I think what you're saying is there's a deterrent effect. If this law is in, then more companies are going to stop in the first place. That's
obviously what we ultimately all want. What we want, I mean, it's not, I mean, other than setting an example, it's not particularly protecting the planet to put someone in jail. What protects the planet is people changing their behavior. So, that's the whole point, in a sense, of putting in place a criminal law, is that it in terms of legal recourse, it is one of the most effective ways to shift people's mindset, is actually using criminal law. And it's interesting because, I mean, we deal with people at quite high level on a regular basis. And, I can promise you, these people aren't stupid. They know perfectly well that we're in a dire situation environmentally and all of those things. It's not a kind of, I mean, there may, of course, be, a few Bond villains out there stroking their white cats, but on the whole, what we're actually looking at is people who intellectually understand something, but in terms of how they culturally behave economically within their companies or their, in their policy making, it doesn't actually tally up. You get a kind of, it's like a kind of cognitive dissonance, if you like. And that's, you know, I don't blame them personally specifically for that, because that's actually, it's you know, it's very hard to change culture when you've grown up with a certain way of approaching things, and you've trained in your, you know, your MBA, your business degree, your, you know, you're working your way up through the company, whatever it is that you've done in the context of the particular system that we have. That is going to kind of constrain the ways you act, even if you can intellectually understand that actually it's not sustainable to do that. And of course, you know, cultural change is something that normally takes quite a long time, but we don't have you know, a long time to actually start shifting course. And given that that's the case, what we need to be looking for are these systemic interventions. And, you know, we believe that, you know, this ecocide law is one such intervention. It's very specific. It's so specific that we've somehow managed to sort of cut through to quite high level conversations, because we don't snag on political stuff, because we just don't even talk politics. We just say, look, we want to criminalize the worst harms to nature. That's it, you know. But it's so specific that it can be relatively straightforwardly inserted into the system that we already have. But actually, criminal laws in their kind of effect actually have quite a strong cultural effect. So, I mean, the example I usually use in the UK is that if you think about the Child Protection Act that came in 1989, I still think that's terribly recent, actually. But and I still have friends whose parents campaigned against that law because they basically felt in the 1980s that they had a God-given right to discipline their children whatever way they saw fit. But the culture had sort of evolved to the point where legislation was made and it became basically, you know, a crime to beat your child. And that now has, that then subsequently had a knock-on effect across the sort of cultural mindset. So now if you stop someone in the street in the UK and say, is it okay to beat your child? Nobody's going to say yes. You know, and partly that is, you know, that is in considerable part because everybody knows that it's a criminal thing to do. So, you know, so there are ways that you know, we see ecocide law as a criminal law, as a kind of accelerator, if you like, of cultural change.
So we're coming close towards the end, folks, but if anyone's got a last question or comment or anything, we'll bung in. But I want to put this one to Jojo. You know, we've got this growing network of, you know, as 27, about 30 centres now. We've helped groups find buildings and set up. And we want to, you know, we're all autonomous and independent, but how can we get behind ecocide law more so that maybe, you know, some of the 27 existing centres can put it in their windows? Is there information packs? Who can we pressure? Is there MPs? How can we get this, you know, pushed through in Britain, you know, to link up with the kind of UK?
I mean, we would say, I mean, actually, we would say that, you know, potentially you can start talking about that earlier than we had previously thought, given that the election's just been announced for July. So basically, you know, once we know who is going to be in those seats of power after that date, that is the time to get talking about it. And, you know, that is the time to then be potentially, you know, effectively wherever you're interacting with policy, whether that's local, whether that's national, you know, to bring ecocide law into that conversation and to say, look, you know, this is something we can see. It's a direction that the rest of the world is already starting to move in. We need to do it here. It's already being advanced in Scotland. There's already a bill that's being put together in Scotland around ecocide. So, you know, and I have no doubt that, you know, that the Scottish will enjoy poking Westminster a bit about that. And so that can be done. I mean, we just had a webinar this morning around the situation in Ireland, and you know, that there's definitely going to be room post-election to bring this up at many different levels. And of course, if you are putting out information publicly in the context of what you're doing, and it might be in the context of your activism, but it might also be in the context of your day job, you know, do you create articles? Does your organization, does your group create articles or interact with the public in events and those kind of things? And can ecocide law be brought into that as part of the conversation? And of course, the same is true in our private networks. We all have private networks, and you know, in terms of our day jobs or whatever, you know, we all have sectors that we might be working in. You know, I mean, let's say, I don't know, if you're working in the NHS, you know, where are the conferences that might be relevant to have something like this, you know, pop up in the discussion, and where can that be brought in? You know, the same could be true of any number of different different industries and different media, different sectors. So, but also I would say, if you go to our website, which is stopecocide.earth, there's quite there's an act now menu as long as my arm, and among other things, it includes, for example, files for printing if you want to print out posters or leaflets and that sort of thing, locally speaking. So we're also quite open to sort of sending batches of postcards or leaflets to people, if that's felt to be useful. But as I say, I think timing wise, it's going to happen sooner than we anticipated. It will be very relevant. I mean, my personal advice would be wait till after the election so that we know what government we've got in place, and therefore we can think about where those pressure points are. But also doing things like as Camden Council did and as Oxford City Council did many years ago, actually, is passing motions supporting ecocide as a crime and as an international crime as well. Is also all helps, because it all helps to build that conversation, and that conversation is what ultimately supports those elected representatives doing something about it at the high level.
Brilliant, absolutely brilliant. We need to work at all levels. 300 councils declared climate emergency after we got the streets up for about 11 days. I think 300 councils and many other groups declaring we need ecocide law. This is an absolutely incredible initiative. I remember for years giving out leaflets. I'm really glad we're making progress now, and EC's bringing in, and some of the things you've mentioned there, Scotland. And thanks for all your massive, hard, relentless work, Jojo, and to the late great Polly Higgins. So I think that's most of what we got time for tonight, folks. Thank you so much for coming. Put 3 words in the chat about what you thought about tonight. Send us some love. Lovely to see you all. Next week we've got Karen from Friends of the Earth, the warehouse in Friends of the Earth, coming to talk about their journey for the last 30-40 years running a centre in Birmingham. And the following week we've got George Marshall, who's a very long experienced activist from the early days. He's been to most of the COP climate summits over the years, and he's going to talk to us about 30 years of activism, but also about talking to people that you don't always agree with and reaching out to the other side and getting people together. So I'll leave the final word to Jojo. Thank you so much for coming. Really appreciate. Over to you for a parting word.
Yeah, no, just amazing. Thank you so much for having me. And also I would just say that so much of this is about connectivity and collaboration. I mean, I super appreciate your words to me personally, but I am very much not alone in this. This is really an expanding and collaborative network, with groups all around the world, and also sort of special interest networks around different things like oceans and farming and business and all this kind of thing as well. So there's a lot of voices now that are part of this work, and it's been a great opportunity to speak with you all, and I hope that the information has been useful and that you'll carry it out into whatever networks you belong to. Thank you.
Brilliant. There you go. The word. Get to stopecocide.earth and download those materials. Stick them up in the windows of your 27 centres, and hopefully many other groups setting up centres soon. Let's network it. Thank you so much, Jojo. Have a great time, everyone. I'm going to stop the recording for a second if I can work that out on the phone, or actually, Helen, can you work it out? I'm looking on a phone here. But I think that might end the whole thing. Record. Okay, stop recording. Got it. Okay.